They called her Typhoid Mary, and even though she never actually showed signs of the disease, she was still responsible for infecting at least 22 people. This was a woman whose touch could bring death and whose cooking could kill. And when the rich family she worked for fell victim to a mysterious plague, they brought in an investigator who would end up becoming her worst nightmare. It was 1907, and the wealthy family in question lived at 54 1/2 West 57th Street in New York City. They had hired a new Irish cook named Mary Mallon, but despite her delicious meals, one by one, members of the family started coming down with a high fever, weakness, and stomach pains. First, it was the children, then their parents, and finally the servants. By the time it was over, 7 members of the household had been stricken with typhoid fever, and one of them would die. The family needed answers. Who or what was making them all sick? To find out, they turned to a man named George Soper. He wasn't a doctor, but a sanitary engineer who specialized in plumbing. That was a real job back then, by the way. But he was the best person for the job, since doctors at the time didn't know how typhoid fever was transmitted, and they weren't much help in the investigation. Soper began his investigation by examining the house where the family lived. He searched for unsanitary conditions, bad water, sewage leaks, and anything else that could be the source of the infection. But he couldn't find anything. Then he started questioning the staff, and it wasn't long before he learned that Mary Mallon had been working as a cook in several other wealthy homes over the past 7 years. And after checking with those families, he discovered that 22 people had become sick with typhoid fever in homes where Mary had been employed. Soper became convinced that Mary was somehow the cause of the outbreaks, but this was a very controversial idea at the time. See, there was a theory that typhoid fever was spread by contact with a sick person, or by eating or drinking contaminated food or water. But it was also thought that once a person recovered from typhoid, they were immune to it for the rest of their lives. And here was Mary, spreading the disease to multiple families without getting sick herself. But how could this be possible? Well, enter the concept of the healthy carrier, someone who can transmit a disease but never shows any symptoms of it themselves. Today we know that this is a thing. We know that people who don't show symptoms can still infect others. We have all sorts of protocols in place to deal with it. But back in 1907, nobody really believed in healthy carriers. So Soper was basically claiming that this woman was somehow magically causing people to get sick without being sick herself. To make matters worse, Mary was completely skeptical. In fact, she was outraged when Soper confronted her about the outbreak. She absolutely denied everything he told her. But what was the alternative? There was no scientific evidence proving how typhoid fever was spread. All they had was this woman's testimony, and Mary insisted she was telling the truth. When Soper asked Mary if he could send some of her excrement to a lab for testing, she slapped him across the face. Maybe it was self-defense. After all, he did just accuse her of murder. But naturally, this only made things worse. And at that point, Soper had no choice but to turn Mary into the authorities. She was arrested and taken to court, and while everyone involved wanted to use her as an example to scare other potential carriers, Mary's rights were still protected. Nobody could force her to undergo a medical exam, and that meant her case would have to go to trial unless she agreed to take a test voluntarily. But Mary was desperate to clear her name and prove that she was on some kind of animal rights activist. So she reluctantly agreed to provide samples of her urine and stool. The samples were collected and sent to the lab, but Mary's lawyer made sure that neither the samples nor the results were ever presented in court. And wouldn't you know it, the tests came back negative. Soper was shocked, but Mary's lawyer was able to use the inconclusive results to argue that his client was innocent. For a moment, it looked like Mary would be acquitted. But then something unexpected happened. Doctors who had been following the case closely demanded that Mary be held for further observation. They wanted to keep her under observation to see if she developed symptoms of typhoid fever. It was a controversial move, and it was hotly debated in the media. But eventually, Mary was ordered to spend 6 months in quarantine at North Brother Island Hospital in New York. For her entire stay, she was examined regularly by some of the top doctors in the country. They observed her behavior, took regular samples of her excrement, and generally made sure that she didn't leave the hospital alive. At first, Mary was defiant. She demanded to be released and sued the state for false imprisonment. But after 2 years, she had still shown no symptoms of typhoid, and nobody really knew what to do with her. Eventually, she gave up and spent the rest of her life in the hospital until her death in 1938. In total, she spent more than 26 years in quarantine, which raises a pretty big question. How could this have happened? How could someone spend that much time around sick people and never develop symptoms themselves? Well, as you might imagine, it has everything to do with hygiene. You see, people don't contract typhoid fever by being around someone with the disease. Rather, it's spread through contaminated food and water. And not just any contamination, mind you. The bacteria that causes typhoid fever needs to be inside the cells of a person's digestive system before it can spread. So let's say Mary touched a surface with contaminated feces on it. Then she prepared food without washing her hands. Then she served that food to a member of the family without realizing that they had contracted typhoid fever from her. It doesn't mean that Mary was a carrier. It means that she was a victim of poor hygiene, period. What's more, it would explain why she refused to believe she was a carrier. If she had no idea that she was sick, why would she think she was responsible for the outbreaks? Unfortunately, the science of disease transmission wasn't well understood at the time, and ultimately, Mary was convicted for a crime she didn't commit. If anything, she was a victim of circumstance and of the times that she lived in. Still, though, her story changed the world for the better. Without Mary's sacrifice, we may have never learned how dangerous carriers are and how easily diseases can be transmitted. But that's not all she gave us. Her story also left us with a whole host of questions. Here are some interesting facts you might not have known about Mary that will change the way you look at her story. Did you know that Mary wasn't the first healthy carrier ever identified? No. The first person ever identified as a healthy carrier of typhoid fever was a milkman named Joseph. His story was covered widely in the press at the time, but he quickly disappeared from public view. However, he wasn't the last either. In the decades following Mary's death, thousands of healthy carriers were identified. Was Mary Mallon mentally ill? The answer is no. Despite what some sources claim, Mary was not insane. Doctors who examined her concluded that she was perfectly sane. She just didn't believe she was a carrier because she wasn't showing any symptoms. Did Mary love to cook? Yes. In fact, Mary considered cooking to be a respectable profession, and she took pride in her work. In her spare time, she would look through cookbooks and plan out delicious meals for the families she worked for. Now, check out this video. Meet the real Hannibal Lecter. Or check out this video instead.